The blue and red lights flashed in Jim Walker's rearview mirror, bouncing off the inside of his dusty old truck. He let out a slow breath, pulling over to the side of the empty highway. It wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over, wouldn't be the last, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way the cop came up too fast, his boots crunching against the gravel like he had something to prove. Maybe it was the way he tapped his flashlight against the side of the truck, a little too hard, like he was already annoyed. Jim watched in his side mirror as the officer, young, square-jawed, full of attitude, stepped up to the window, hand resting a little too comfortably on his holster. "License and registration," the officer said, voice clipped, like Jim was already wasting his time. Jim nodded, moving slowly. Everything Jim did these days was slow, not by choice. His left leg, the prosthetic one, made things like reaching for the glove compartment a process. But Officer Derek Moore wasn't interested in patience. Jim had barely started moving when Moore let out a sharp, impatient breath. "Jesus, hurry up," the cop muttered. "What's the holdup, Grandpa?" Jim froze for just a second. Not because he was offended, but because the old instincts kicked in. Years of training, years of war, years of discipline told him to assess the situation. This wasn't a fight. Not yet. Jim finished grabbing his registration and handed it over, his face unreadable. Moore snatched it from his fingers without even a glance at him. Jim just watched, waiting. The cop skimmed through the paperwork, his lips pulling into a slight smirk. "You disabled or just lazy?" Jim exhaled through his nose. Moore didn't even look up. "You got that veteran tag, but I see guys like you all the time, collecting a check, milking the system, while the rest of us are out here working." He shook his head like he was disappointed, like he knew Jim. Jim's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. For a long moment, he said nothing. He'd been called a lot of things in his life. Some of them earned, some of them not. But this was new, and that was a problem. Moore tapped the flashlight against the door again, clearly enjoying himself. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Jim finally looked at him. It wasn't an angry look. It wasn't even a look of disappointment. It was just calm, controlled, but there was something behind it. Something Officer Moore had never seen before. Something that made the back of his neck prickle. Jim's voice was quiet when he spoke. "You got any idea who you're talking to, son?" Moore laughed, a sharp mocking sound. "Oh, here we go," he said, shaking his head. "You some kind of big deal, old man? Some kind of war hero?" Jim tilted his head slightly. "Go ahead," he said, his voice dead even. Moore frowned. "Go ahead and what?" Jim reached into his pocket slowly, pulled out an old, worn military ID, and held it up. Moore's smirk disappeared instantly. Because the moment he saw it, the rank, the medals, the commendations, he knew. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The second Officer Moore's eyes locked onto that ID, his expression changed. Jim saw the shift immediately. The confidence wavered, the mockery evaporated. The young officer's jaw tensed, his fingers twitching slightly on the flashlight in his hand. Jim didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just let the silence stretch, let the moment sink in. "You still think I'm milking the system?" Jim asked, his voice even. Moore swallowed hard. He had run his mouth without thinking, without looking, and now he was staring at the service record of a Silver Star recipient, a Marine Force recon legend, a man who had done things Moore couldn't even imagine, a man who had bled for this country, while kids like him were still in high school worrying about prom dates. Moore had thought he was talking down to some nobody. Turns out, he was talking to the kind of man his academy instructors had probably called a damn hero. Jim finally slid the ID back into his wallet. "You were saying?" Moore didn't respond. For the first time in his life, he felt like a child standing in front of a real man. His mouth opened, then closed again. Nothing he could say would fix this. Jim leaned forward slightly, his calm voice carrying weight. "You think I lost this leg sitting on my ass? You think I spent years overseas watching my brothers die so I could come home and be disrespected by a punk with a badge?" Moore stiffened, but Jim wasn't done. "You ever drag a dying man out of a burning Humvee? You ever get shot at and still run straight into the fight? You ever bury a friend knowing you were supposed to be the one in that coffin?" Moore had nothing to say. His throat worked, but no words came out. Jim nodded slowly. Didn't think so. Moore looked away, shame creeping across his face. For the first time in his career, he felt small. Jim exhaled and reached for his gear shift. He could have torn this kid apart, could have filed a complaint, reported him, ruined his damn career. But that wasn't who Jim was. He'd been a leader once. And a real leader doesn't just punish mistakes, he makes sure they don't happen again. Jim put the truck into drive. "Next time you want to talk down to somebody, officer," he said, voice quiet but sharp as a blade, "make sure they ain't the reason you get to wear that badge." Moore flinched like he had been slapped. Jim didn't say another word, didn't look back, just rolled up the window and drove away, leaving behind a man who would never forget the lesson he just learned.